Good morning, everyone. This is Abby Heinemeyer from CCM. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items. The first is that this webinar is recorded and will be distributed to attendees following the presentation. Additionally, all attendees are muted, but we want to encourage you all to participate. You can do this by asking questions throughout the presentation, which can be done so on the control panel on the right side of your screen. All questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Today, we're very lucky to have Jeff Ziplow and Ron Nossick from Bloom Shapiro to present for us. I'm going to hand it on over to Ron.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. As indicated, I'm Ron Nossick. I'm a partner at Bloom Shapiro in the firm's government industry group. I've been working in public accounting since 1985, and quite honestly have spent my entire career serving state and local governmental entities, doing audit work. With us from Bloom also today, as mentioned, is Jeff Ziplow. Jeff is a partner in the firm's risk advisory service group. Jeff has a significant experience working with organizations to assess their internal IT controls as they relate to business operations, and helps develop recommendations to mitigate risk. And quite honestly, is one of the most talented all-around business strategists I've met in my 35 years in public accounting. So I'm glad he's along for the ride with me today. I'm sure what he has to say is going to be probably a lot more interesting than what I'm going to have to say. But we'll get into my program here, which if Jeff, you want to pop, yeah, thank you. So what we'll talk about today is well, it's defined as new budgeting process on the slide. It's really just a modification of the typical budget process that we follow. I'm also going to talk to you a little bit about cash flow modeling, and then Jeff will take it from there relative to internal and external virtual processes, teleworker access, touchless payments, and then we'll have leave some time for some Q&A. So Jeff, if you want to jump up relative to budgeting process. So what I want to talk to you today about are two topics that I think are very complementary to one another, and in my mind, becoming an ever increasing necessity in local government. And they are the annual budget process, and in the case of today's conversation, rethinking that process, and then cash flow modeling. Much of today's program was clearly prompted by the COVID-19 crisis that we're all living through right now, and the possible ramifications of widespread disruption caused by it. But if we're going to be honest with one another, I think you'll find the points that will be raised today in this program have been out there in need of implementation for some time. So for my time, as I said, we'll touch briefly on what I feel are the limitations of the typical annual budget process, and then talk a little bit more about an alternative, which would be a long-term budget forecasting process. Many of you may already be developing budget plans that contain multiple years. So if you are, I applaud you, and my comments may simply be supportive of your process, or perhaps provide some alternative considerations to it. And finally, then we'll touch on the process of cash flow modeling, which I think can be a far better monitoring tool relative to the budget during the fiscal year, and more importantly, a tool to enable governments to better anticipate liquidity problems that may be on the horizon. I didn't mention this early on, but I have served in public office before as well, and typically what I saw then and what I still see in attendance to city council and board of finance meetings typically is a budget to actual report on a monthly or quarterly basis. And I think when we talk about the cash flow model, you'll see why I think it's a far better and more effective monitoring tool. So slide 2 there, the annual budget process. What is it? And this, quite frankly, is my opinion. But so first and foremost, I believe it's the most important policy and decision-making process performed annually. However, because it is developed on a one-year perspective, it tends to emphasize short-term tactics over long-term strategies. Typically, the process does not include the consideration of alternative outcomes and thus lacks the ability to be quickly modified if crisis develops. It is static, it's not flexible in nature, and when events occur that negatively impact that budget, typical actions are taken. And those, in my history, kind of come from a toolbox that's been in place for a long time. And it's, first it's spending freezes and elimination of hiring plans, and then also the deferment of new initiatives and or the appropriation of fund balance reserves to meet the needs that whatever the community is facing, are necessary to be met. So seldom are any of those actions previously thought out. They're typically, as I said, simply as actions taken that are based on history. The most important target, in my opinion, relative to that toolbox, if you will, is the deferment of new initiatives. That deferment, as I've seen in my career, that deferment most often leads to a complete elimination of that initiative. It's rarely brought back again. And as I said, little, if any, thought is given to mitigation plans in advance, and thus when a problem or crisis does occur, the course of action is often not well thought out and often detrimental to the long-term goals and objectives to the community. So that's, in a nutshell, in my opinion, the limitations, if you will, of what is the typical annual budget process that is followed by most governmental entities. The next slide we'll talk about here is long-term budget forecasting. So what I'm saying here is that government should consider as an alternative the process of long-term budget forecasting in place of the annual one-year budget. One thing I want to be clear on is that long-term budget forecasting is not simply status quo data projected over time. And what I mean by that is it's not last year's budget plus 2% over a 3-year period or a 5-year period or whatever the long-term outlook is that you want to model over. It truly takes more thought and consideration than just applying an increase factor. The process can allow, if followed, the process can allow for the nonlinear aspects of actual financial activity to be factored into the long or at least longer term projections. Doing this will allow for variable elements to enter into the budgetary projections. The current year plan can be developed with what-if scenarios, thus allowing for pre-established course of action if negative events occur. If properly documented and vetted, one of the benefits here is that those actions will have already been accepted by the majority, communicated to the public, and while painful, possibly in nature, acceptance has already been provided, and everyone has had their opportunity, so to speak, to raise any concerns or support for those courses of action. Deliberating actions in a time of crisis only puts the government in greater jeopardy because those deliberations take time. And, I think we all understand that when faced with a crisis, time is not your friend. The process does not have to be overwhelming. Think of it simply as developing a variable budget plan on best case, likely case, and worst case scenarios. The long-term aspects of it should allow for the integration of policy goals and initiatives. As I indicated earlier, again, in my mind, in my opinion, this is a significant reason why governments get stuck is that, city managers, mayors, first selectmen, school superintendents, they often have plans for the future that are valid and could really be transformative to their communities, but they never get off the ground because they never get integrated into a budget plan. And you're basically stuck with status quo if you can't get that integrated into budgetary plans. And the easiest method to do that, I think, is dealing with it from a long-term perspective. So to summarize, and if we can jump a slide here, the advantages in long-term budget forecasting are that it can help develop stronger fiscal discipline in normal times and in times of crisis. When coupled with cash flow modeling, it can assist in the early identification of budget problems, and more importantly, create a process where the mitigation plan to those problems has been previously developed and vetted. Finally, it can promote sustainability by identifying the long-term impact of policy decisions. This may take certain new initiatives off the table, but if they were unlikely to succeed, better to learn that in advance than down the road while a program or service is imploding on you. Now, one of the things I want to add is that concept of sustainability, while I don't think is new, I think it's new to the integration of financial planning relative to government. There was a study performed recently by the U.S. Government Accountability Office. It was presented to the United States Congress in December of 2019, and it concluded that state and local government will need to take actions annually in reducing expenditures or raising revenues in order to achieve fiscal balance. The study suggested that if no change in the level of expenditures takes place, revenues would need to increase by 4.2% annually to achieve fiscal balance. Alternatively, if no change in revenue takes place, non-debt expenditures would need to decrease by 3.2% annually. And the scarier thing for this study suggests that overall total expenditure reductions would have to come close to 20%. Clearly, the study concludes or suggests that a combination of both revenue increase and an expenditure decrease, or at least some discipline relative to expenditures, needs to be undertaken in order to achieve long-term viability. My own thoughts relative to the concept of sustainability, and this is, I wonder, this is pure hindsight, but if 30 years ago, someone had taken the time to project out what pension and OPEB liabilities were going to look like in 2020, would state and local governments be in the situation they currently find themselves in? I don't know. I clearly don't have an answer to that, but pretty certain that no such undertaking was ever done. So that is really in a nutshell, and I realize it's probably a 30,000 foot view of what long-term budgeting is all about. But what I want to convey is something I did say earlier in this, is that it's not an enormous undertaking or a painful strategy process. It does obviously take some forethought and development of anticipation relative to economies and things of that nature rolling out more than 1 year, but it's not an impossible task by any stretch of the imagination. So we can move now, if we want to jump a slide, to cash flow modeling and what this is all about. And this is pretty simple. And as I said leading in, this really is a tool and can be an effective tool to budget monitoring. And what it is it's basically a model that contains both historical and current cash flow data in order to track the cash flow activity of the community, of the organization. And government revenue cash inflows are typically not very linear. Here in Connecticut, right, our property taxes come in twice a year for the most part. They trickle in on the other off months because of people paying what is delinquent, but for the bulk of it, it's coming in January and July. So if there suddenly are disruptions either to the revenue cycle or the expenditure cycle, which the expenditure cycle does at least tend to be a little more linear, you need to be able to project with some level of accuracy the impact that disruption is going to have on the ability of the government to pay its bills. I would, I think we all would, and it's probably why we're on the phone here today, is I would anticipate there's going to be a revenue decline due to COVID-19, as well as a disruption of the revenue cash flow coming in. Property taxes, I believe, are very likely to decline. If your community is dependent on consumption taxes, restaurant taxes, and hotel taxes, those are likely to decline. And state initiatives relative to property tax deferments and interest reductions, if you don't take the deferment path, are certainly going to reduce the amount of cash that is going to come in the door in January and July. So if none of this has been factored into your fiscal 21 budgets, tracking cash flow is going to be even more important. GFOA held a program on April 24th. It's called Managing Cash Flow in Crisis. And if you can, jump on GFOA's website. I think you can still track that. I'm pretty certain that they archive their programs. But in that program, there was I think 2 or 3 folks that did that webinar. They actually provided the participants with a couple of cash flow template models. One, and again, not overly sophisticated. One was called, I think, simple cash flow, and the other was called super simple cash flow model. But basically, the program was all about this: the building of that model relative to it having ideally at least 1 year history, ideally 3 years, and then tracking on a monthly basis. So you see a history of where your cash position typically depletes, and you get kind of some history relative to, and these templates did include graphing capabilities as to levels of cash that are typically coming in certain periods. So if if July we're collecting 20% or 30% less of what we typically collect, what are we going to look like in December? And this tool and the process of cash flow modeling is going to avail you some ability to see that in advance, to see it over the horizon, and take whatever measures that need to be taken. As I said, it doesn't have to be real detailed to be valuable. My suggestion would be that it needs simply to categorize your revenues and expenditure classifications in line with your annual audited financial statements. And those would be the upfront statements, not the detailed budgetary statement that often is presented as your RSI. And the greater level of detail, probably if you're going to blow it out a little more, would be on the revenue side, but that would be more than sufficient in my mind. And again, the emphasis of the model is to be able to track cash flows on a monthly basis and have comparative data to enable you to compare those flows to historical information. As I said earlier, typically expenditures track uniformly, and that's why I don't think you maybe need as much detail relative to those as you will with revenue. And again, clearly the COVID crisis is heightened the need to really keep an eye on what those revenue streams are doing. And as I said, if you do see it coming, you'll be able to take action, be it through alternative short-term financing options, or again, by accessing fund balance, or by implementing budget modifications that we talked about earlier that preferably have been previously developed and thought out and accepted prior to implementation. So that is going to end my session here. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, and as I said, we've got some time baked into the backside of this to allow for some question and answering. So Jeff, feel free to take it from here.
Thank you, Ron, very much. Very informative, and I appreciate your earlier comments. Well, before I get going, I hope everyone is healthy and well during these crazy times. these are unprecedented times, and I wish and hope everyone's doing well. Over the past couple months, due to COVID, we've seen a number of transformative changes. This includes limited municipal operations. I've never really seen that before, but many municipalities have had limited services or having to do things with, far fewer people in the office, and certainly limiting who is in the municipality or in town hall. We've seen residents who need to be able to obtain various services within the municipality, but obtain them remotely, not being able to go into town hall, but being able to do things from their own personal homes. We've actually seen a new type of employee, the new teleworker. The teleworker who needs to be able to perform work at home in an efficient and effective way. So under the premise of COVID that has created for us this new normal, I think once municipalities are fully open, we really need to rethink how we can perform various activities and tasks, services within a municipality safely, effectively, and securely. And ultimately, from my perspective, this means we really need to start considering how we can operate the municipality in a virtual way, but maintain the overall operations, financial controls, and services provided to residents. So in my presentation, what I wanted to do is start looking at that, looking at the virtual town hall. And in essence, we need to consider what that virtual town hall is going to look like, some of the areas of concern that we need to think about. And as such, I broke my presentation out into two areas. One is the internal side of things, and then the external processes as it relates to the virtual town hall. So let's talk about internal first. We talk about the purchase order process, and this is an internal, obviously, operation. And I would tell you that most municipalities have a purchase order system that would be able to decentralize purchase orders. We'd be able to do things remotely. We'd be able to attach documents to POs as required remotely. We'd be able to provide electronic workflows and sign-offs on those purchase orders. The problem that I have seen is that not every municipality has adopted the use of these electronic tools in order to move us forward into this more virtualized environment. I still see many municipalities still relying on the physical movement of paper. And so I think we need to really rethink this process and utilize the systems better. We need to get rid of processes that kind of go around the purchase requisition, purchase order process. I've seen some communities that have this, I'll call it a voucher process that bypasses, and I think many municipalities have some instances and situations where we are bypassing, the electronic system, the purchase order process, if you will, and we have these manual processes in place that some people are still utilizing, and many times it's from what we've been doing in the past. And even though we've implemented new standards, new ways of doing things, we haven't gotten rid of the old manual processes. So I think what we're really seeing is we need to force all departments to enter their purchase requisitions, their purchase orders electronically. And hands down, it has to occur that way. And in doing so, we can force departments to appropriately provide any type of attachments or documentations within that purchase order. I think we can use COVID as a catalyst to eliminate any of the workarounds that we've seen and that we know. We've identified, and I'm sure many of the municipalities that have joined us on this webinar have departments that have those workarounds, but we can't allow that to happen anymore. And let's use COVID as that way of saying, no, this now needs to be, put into the system like any and all other purchase orders or purchase requisitions. That way we can implement the electronic workflows and the appropriate sign-offs, and we can ensure that once a purchase order is signed off, we can complete that electronic process. Once it's approved, we can electronically send the PO to the vendor. So now we've completed this virtualized process that can be done anywhere, anytime, and it doesn't need to be done from town hall. So that's the purchase order process. I think that the same thing is true from a check processing, be it a vendor or payroll checks. Most municipalities, as we know, are using a combination of hard copy checks and electronic ACH checks. Again, this has worked well, or this is the way we've operated, for many, many years, going from purely hard copy checks now to electronic checks. But I think we're at that time where we need to say, okay, can we eliminate check processing using hard copy checks? And the answer is yes, we can. We probably have situations and instances where we're using electronic checks in place right now, but we need to do it across the board. And let's use COVID as the catalyst to make it happen. So in our new world, we need to consider performing everything electronically. So think about it. No one has to go to the office and process checks anymore. They could be doing this in their home. And we can talk about the security in the home, but another topic for maybe later on in the presentation. But we can do things differently. We can manage all of these through electronic workflows, and we can provide some good segregation of duties and responsibilities, typically through our system and the various workflows, to allow us to eliminate, and I'm going to underscore that a number of times, eliminate the need to print out hard copy checks. We don't need to do it. We can remove that process, hard copy checks, from what we've done in the past and move forward with everything being electronic. So I'm going to move off of that and go to another topic, which is another process. And it's a process that I use and many other outside vendors use, is the request for proposal process. So as an outside vendor, we respond to various proposals, and all municipalities generate RFPs for a wide variety of products and or services. And to be clear, and during the COVID times, and actually it happened to both Ron and myself, we were responding to an RFP. And the RFP process required us to submit hard copy documents. And in fact, because we weren't sure what was going to happen with FedEx and some of the other services, we were concerned. We actually had to hand deliver these documents. And so I guess the thought process here is, we have technology. We have capabilities now that we can look for and react to RFPs in a complete electronic way. We can use electronic signatures. And my point here is that we need to rethink how we can virtualize the RFP process while maintaining controls, while validating signatures. We may have situations where we need to get, a notary to sign it, but there are technology tools out there to allow us for that. So, we can take advantage of technology solutions that exist. My point to everyone is, we need to rethink how we can do that. and still, as I mentioned before, maintain the controls that are in place right now, or that we want to maintain. So I think the RFP process could be an electronic process and make things much easier for us. The other thing is committee meetings, and certainly I know that many of you on this call have been part of our new Zoom meetings, if you're using Zoom. Um, there have been new laws, as you're probably all aware, enacted very recently because of COVID, that suspended the open meeting laws. And I suspect that that type of those new laws are going to remain in effect for a long period of time, if not in perpetuity. And the reason I say that is um, I think we're starting to realize that we can have good committee meetings, but we don't need to be in town hall to make that happen. We do need to establish protocols to have the committee meetings performed in a remote way to allow boards and councils to meet and allow for residents to provide input. I know many municipalities were forced to implement, our remote committee meetings quickly. Many, as I mentioned earlier, turned to Zoom to make that happen. But we can now, things are, are starting to get back to a little bit of normalcy. So we can now take a step back and rethink how we can use these technologies to implement remote meetings across all areas of the municipality. I do believe that we need to create formal protocols to be established and documented so that everyone understands what these new rules and processes look like. We need to look at what tools we'll be using and how we can secure those tools. We need to make sure and eliminate, and I'm sure all of you have heard the term Zoom bombing. Well, we need to eliminate a person from taking over the video session. We can do this, and we can control these sessions, and there are tools out there that we need to put in place to ensure and protect our committee meetings in a remote fashion. But they exist now, and so we should start looking at how we can continue what we've been forced to implement, but do it in a secure and controlled manner. So with that, I'd like to turn to external operations. And, when I think of external facing services, if you will, um, you know, I've identified two departments initially that I think are in okay shape. Hopefully, from a tax assessor collector, I know most municipalities, I can't say all, but I know most municipalities do have the ability to look up and review the tax assessments and tax information based on, parcel, based on resident. Um, Many have the ability to pay taxes remotely. And so we've put in place some relatively good ways to access assessor and collector information, to review what the assessment is, and how to pay the taxes remotely. I think we need to go a couple steps further. How would we implement remote certificates of correction? How can we enhance the assessor and collector processes to do it remotely? The tools exist. We just need to put in place better processes, if you will. Park and Rec is another area that I think is in good shape or okay shape. Many of us are using a tool set that allows us to do things remotely via a website, that including signing up for programs and paying for programs. I know Park and Rec is going to change significantly. And so that obviously needs to be incorporated into whatever the overall game plan is. But certainly the tools exist today. I think the one area or two areas that I think that we're going to need to spend some time on is the permitting process, as well as what goes on, in the town clerk's office. Um, from a permitting process perspective, um, similar to my discussion with purchase orders, there are many municipalities that do have the ability to create and process permits electronically. I've actually had a conversation with a couple of municipalities recently in Connecticut that they've had or have newer systems. They put newer systems in place. Unfortunately, they didn't put in all of the workflows and electronic sign-offs that could have been put in place to decentralize the permitting process. And so our ability to go back and rethink our permitting process with online forms, our ability to attach documents or residents or anyone to attach documents to the permits. Many of our systems do allow that right now. We just haven't implemented. So I guess my point to folks on the webinar is now's the time to start looking at this um, and rethink how we can create a more robust permitting process online. So that would give our residents the ability to do things online, to do things in a virtual way, 7 by 24 by 365. And I think that is certainly promoting this overall concept of the virtual town hall. Town clerk's office, and this is one of the areas, with land records, vital records, dog licenses. This may be one of the toughest departments to virtualize. In working with many of the town clerk's offices, in the past, they need, and they want a lot of paper. And again, I think part of this overall process and program of virtualization is to let's sit down with town clerks and really rethink what they're doing, how they're doing it. I know some municipalities in Connecticut, and there are some actually in Vermont, are implementing a product. I think it's called Record Hub, which is linked to their COT system, and it does provide some abilities for remote access and doing things electronically. Um, Clearly, we need to create a game plan and a playbook, if you will, to take virtualization and promote it within the town clerk's office, because we need to be able to provide those services, but we need to be able to virtualize those services. We need to figure out how we're going to allow for electronic signatures, and maybe even notary services as well. So those are some thoughts, if you will, regarding internal and external operations. What I'd like to do is move towards the new teleworker and understand a little bit more about what teleworking is, and some considerations, if you will, for promoting teleworking. So clearly, there are a number of areas that one needs to consider when you think about teleworking. Think about new processes and procedures. I think about HR related issues that we really need to be thinking about. I would tell you most municipalities did not really have a remote work from home type of policies and procedures. And again, I think we need to start thinking differently. And because I do believe that we're not going to be opening up town hall and let the floodgates of all employees come in all at once and go back to what the old normal used to look like. I think we will be having this new normal for a very, very long and extended period of time. And so what are those processes? What tools do our employees need to have in their office in their home. And then we also need to be thinking about, vendors and third-party vendors that we're working with and how we provide access and integrate with them. We could probably spend the entire webinar on just these topics and spend an entire day or hour or two on these topics. But instead, what I thought I'd like to do is just spend a little bit of time talking about protecting your municipality and the security that one needs to think about and implementing, good cyber hygiene through a couple of tools. One is this thing called a VPN, a virtual private network. And so as a municipality, and if we're having people working at home or working remotely, we need to make sure that we've implemented a VPN, a virtual private network. What it really does is it creates what's known as a secure tunnel that goes from your home office to the municipality and does it so that it looks actually as if it's a tunnel. No one can break into that tunnel. And if someone did, and they were to look at and inspect the information within that tunnel, it's encrypted information anyway. So having and implementing a VPN is extremely important and something that should be in place, hopefully, for all the municipalities. The next tool is multi-factor authentication, something you know and something you have. So how it works is we have an application. So there are some municipalities that are using Office 365. Inside the office, inside the municipality, we can just access email and access information in Office 365 without any additional passwords or security because we're in a secure environment. But from working at home, we need to implement multi-factor authentication. So what multi-factor authentication does is when we're remote outside of the municipality, what will happen is when we go to access an application, in this case, we'll just use the example of Office 365, it will actually either call us, send us a text message, or provide us with some information that we have to enter into a question that is asked. And that way, if an attacker did get our user ID and password, they would not know the text message, or they would not know if and how I'm accessing or responding to a question. And so multi-factor authentication, to be quite frank, is a must that we have to implement um, for all municipalities and hopefully most of the applications. You've probably seen multi-factor authentication, with a lot of or a number of financial institutions. And one of the things I just wanted to point out here is please be aware that they'll ask you these security questions: what's your pet's name, where do you go to high school, favorite movie. Most, if not all of those, are on social media. So do not use the true answer to any of those questions that I showed you. Put in place some type of response that has nothing to do with those security questions. And this is just a tip for folks from a security perspective. Blue jumping jacks is not part of my social media. It's not a pet's name. It's not my high school, and certainly not my favorite movie. Employees are one of your biggest assets from a security perspective. And so one of the things I strongly suggest is helping your employees out and providing more training and actually phishing your employees. The employees can be your first line of defense. They can identify incidents very quickly, but they need training. And so I would provide training provide and actually fish your employees to identify those folks that need some additional help and support in this area. So let's move on, because I'm looking at the time now. Let's move on to touchless payments. And, touchless payments some people call it contactless payments, but it's the ability for someone to use their cell phone, um, typically use a cell phone, or it could be an RFID card, and swipe it over a device. So we don't have to hand anyone our credit cards anymore. We don't have to we don't have to be worried about, contact with other folks. We can use mobile payment applications. I've seen a lot of that with on our cell phones. How can we use them? We can use them for in-office payments. Again, we can use our mobile wallets or and give people the ability to literally just hold their phone over a device, and the payment gets processed. We can use the same tools or devices for online payments, and I think many municipalities, again, not all, but many municipalities have the ability to have the touchless parking meters. And my point here is that we should be looking more and more at these touchless payments. Think about it at a transfer station if need be, to pay for services, so that we don't have to hand anyone a check or hand anyone a credit card. We can just swipe or place our device over another device, and it will read it and charge us appropriately. It helps ease the situation of social distancing. It expands the options for residents to pay, and it creates a broad and good municipal-wide standard across the entire municipality. So I didn't want to lose sight of the fact that we do have some questions. So I'm going to move on to questions and answers. And let's see, first question I have, Ron, I think this is for you. In developing budget modification alternatives, what would be some thoughts on how to do that?
Where that would start is first and foremost is to evaluate your services and programs. So which programs are essential, which programs are worthwhile, which are non-essential. And there are non-essential programs clearly in government, and that would be the starting point. So relative to non-essential programs, evaluate how that program could be pared down, or if need be, fully eliminated in order to address the financial crisis or financial issue that you're dealing with. So that would be my starting point.
Great, thank you. Hey, Ron, another question came up. Can you post the link to the study that you were discussing earlier, I guess, on the long-term budgeting forecast?
Relative to
what, we can provide that link, and I'll put it into I'll get the link from you, Ron, and we can put it into the presentation package at the very end. How about that?
That's fine. Just I'm not sure if you're talking about the GFOA program or the report that was provided to the United States Congress.
I think it was the report, but we can put in both, right?
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
Another question. Once a long-term budget plan is developed, how often do you need to revisit it?
Well, I think from a brief perspective, I would evaluate it annually, but that would be brief. If in the case of that process, current economics and the economy and the economy within your community is moving along as you projected when you first built out that long-term budgetary model. And then, on top of that, it would be episodic. If something happens, clearly you're going to have to take a deeper dive. But once again, there should be a list of actions that you have already pre-considered to take relative to what's going on relative to that episode.
Got it. Thank you. There's a question here. You did not mention payroll, which is done manually in many places. Some employees do not use the computer and need help of other employees to enter timesheets and look at pay stubs. So I'll take that. I didn't directly talk about payroll, but we can enter time in electronically, and many places have that ability today. Unfortunately, I've also seen we're not doing it effectively. And again, what I'm trying to create is a new vision, which is payroll can be done electronically. So even before we get to payroll, let's talk about the time entry process. The time entry process can be done electronically, and there's a number of tools out there that allow for us to do it. There's part of that process also is, a way to review time sheets and then be able to reach out to folks if there's any questions on those time sheets, and then follow through with the process of actually signing off. And I do understand that I'm trying to create something that I'm trying to keep it simplistic, because I do very much believe it's doable. It's not for some municipalities, it's not going to be done tomorrow, but we need to plan for it, and we can start putting in place different procedures and different ways of looking at things as it relates to the entire payroll process. And I do believe it starts in the time entry component, and moves its way forward. But there are many municipalities that do have capabilities right now where they can do most of payroll electronically, including the time entry process. Another question: it will take a substantial revision of the Freedom of Information Act to allow for virtual remote meetings. Why do you believe this will be adopted? This is I don't know any more than the folks on this webinar. I do know, however, that I think we have learned that we can effectively have meetings remotely through video conferencing. I think there are, as you pointed out, a number of considerations that we need to think about. But as it relates to, we can record those meetings. We can put information out online and make it available to people for people to access. We can figure out ways to put hard copies out if need be. So again, I think this is a work in process as it relates to committee meetings, but something that should be explored and reviewed in more detail. Another question came up: would touchless payments be a way around the high credit card fees for paying taxes? Touchless payments still have fees associated with them. I have not done an analysis, quite frankly, to determine if they're on par with, less, or more than, I guess, the standard fees. So that's something that's a work in process and a takeaway that I need to learn a little bit more about. I think it also depends on the vendors that you're using as it relates to those fees. Another question came in: do municipalities need to be concerned about employees' home internet connection and the security from their home? The answer to that is yes. When we allow folks from home to gain access into our remote connections, our remote or into the office, we're literally providing a much broader landscape for attackers to take advantage. And so we do need to be concerned about employees working from home and having a secure environment at home. One of the things I would always tell folks is to make sure that you've changed any of the standard security user ID and passwords on your firewall at home, and enable any security settings on those firewalls. A lot of times those standard security user ID and passwords get set by the factory, so to speak, and so changing them will significantly enhance security for the employee working at home. Ron, I believe this one is for you. Once a cash flow analysis is done, what do you recommend for lead times to seriously look at short-term financing? Should a town go forward with obtaining authorization from the Board of Finance for tax anticipation note if necessary?
Yeah, I think, and I hate to fall into my auditor box, but that really is a conversation you should have with your financial advisor. But I don't think that there are any steadfast parameters, to be honest with you, in order to go into the market. But it really wouldn't be a recommendation from an auditor. I apologize for skirting that a little bit, but the financial advisor would be far more capable of answering that.
Sounds good. Ron, thank you very much. I think we've gone through the questions overall, and I just want to thank everyone for joining us today for our Planning of the Future webinar. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us. Be safe and stay healthy, and we will talk to you soon. I will also put into place the links into the presentation package before it gets sent out to everyone, so you'll have that information available to you. Thank you again.